Welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. If you love learning about mysterious historical tales, this is the place for you. The human species has shaped and reshaped our world continuously as each generation has sought to make its own mark throughout history. It is our history. It is incredible and diverse, but it is often shrouded in mystery. Join me and together we'll delve into some of the most fascinating parts of human history. As gruesome, mysterious or unbelievable that these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have left their mark on our historical landscape. So now let's take a look at the historical mystery in this episode. On the morning of October the 14th, 1066, England held its breath. By sunset, everything had changed. A king lay dead, a dynasty lay broken, and a question, one that has haunted England for nearly 1,000 years, was born. What happened to the body of King Harold Godwinson? In this episode, we're diving into one of medieval England's most enduring mysteries, the final resting place of the last Anglo-Saxon King of England. Was he buried with honour? Was he hidden in secret? Was his corpse mutilated, denied burial altogether? Or did he survive, walking away into legend? Because when kings fall, history doesn't always tell the truth. Sometimes it whispers. Before we can talk about Harold's death, we need to understand who he was. Harold Godwinson wasn't supposed to be king. Not really. He was the son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful noble family in England. But royal blood? That was debatable. There was no ancient royal bloodline. His father, Wulfnoth, was a local thane. A thane is a member of the minor aristocracy. They served the king or high-ranking nobles and acted as military retainers. In fact, thanes formed the backbone of the army itself. So it's fair to say that they were an important family, but hardly legendary. What Godwin had instead, though, was timing, ambition, and a sharp understanding of politics. During the reign of the Danish king Canute the Great, Godwin rose fast through the ranks. He proved himself loyal and was a capable military leader, but most importantly, he was useful. By the 1020s he had become Earl of Wessex, controlling the richest and most powerful region in England. Wessex wasn't just another earldom, it was the economic heart of the country, covering much of southern England. With its wealth, manpower and strategic importance, Godwin became more powerful than any other noble, arguably more powerful than the king himself. And he didn't stop there. Godwin built a dynasty. His sons, including Harold Godwinson, Tostig and Gyrth, were placed into earldoms across England, effectively turning the Godwin family into a ruling network. But his most brilliant move
was one of marriage. In 1045, Godwin's daughter Edith married Edward the Confessor, the King of England himself. This marriage was explosive in political terms. Edward had spent much of his life in exile in Normandy and lacked a strong English power base. By marrying Edith, he tied himself directly to the most powerful family in the land. For Godwin, it meant royal legitimacy. His bloodline was now one step from the throne itself. But this alliance was uneasy. Edward distrusted the Godwins, and Godwin was accused, probably unfairly, of involvement in the murder of Edward's brother. Their relationship swung between cooperation and open conflict. Still, when Godwin died in 1053, his legacy was secure. Within 13 years, his son Harold would sit on the throne. In January 1066, Edward the Confessor died childless. England faced a crisis. No clear heir, no written will, just powerful men and fragile promises. Harold Godwinson made it clear that on his deathbed, Edward the Confessor had named him as the heir. The Witan, which was an Anglo-Saxon council of wise men, high-ranking nobles, bishops, and ealdormen, existed to advise kings, debate laws and taxation, as well as any other legal matters. And it was the Witan who chose Harold to be the next king of the Anglo-Saxons. He was experienced, but importantly, he was English. And of course the term Engleland, or English, was a new word. Land of the Angles is what it stood for. The Angles were the Germanic tribes who migrated to the Roman world of Britannia in the 5th century. It was after the unification of the Kingdom of England under Aethelstan in 927, and it is at this point that this island nation in the North Sea began to be referred to as England, and the people of it referred to as English. And so it seems clear Harold Godwinson would be the next king of the Anglo-Saxons, of England, of England. He was already the kingdom's strongest military leader, but there was a problem. Across the Channel, Duke William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the throne. Some historians suggest that in the year 1051, William made a trip to England from Normandy to see Edward the Confessor himself, and it is here that William claimed that Edward had promised that he should succeed him as King of England. In 1064, Harold Godwinson made a trip to Normandy, and William again claimed that Harold Godwinson had also promised that William could succeed the English throne. So we have two protagonists, each claiming that Edward the Confessor had promised them the English throne. Duke William was a distant relative of Edward the Confessor, and of course Harold Godwinson was Edward's brother-in-law. Clearly, a complex political situation is beginning to evolve. Harold Godwinson is sure that Edward the Confessor named him as the heir to the English throne, but Duke William of Normandy says that Edward the Confessor promised him the throne, and even that Harold Godwinson promised it to him too. There is, however, a third claimant. Up in Norway, the fearsome Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, says that he is going to claim the English crown, based on an old Viking agreement most English nobles barely remember. Harold succeeded Magnus I of Norway in 1046. Magnus had been promised the kingdom of Denmark, by Harthacnut, who was King of England from 1040 to 1042. Harold claimed the Kingdom of Denmark as part of the legacy of Magnus. In 1064, Harold gave up trying to secure Denmark and instead focused on the English throne because of this earlier Anglo-Danish kingdom that once existed. To make matters worse for Harold Godwinson, in 1066, his brother, Tostig Godwinson, invited Harald Hardrada to join him in rebelling against his own brother, Harold Godwinson, to secure the English throne. We must remember this is an era where loyalties are fluid and power is everything. The year 1066 looms, and we have 3 would-be kings, but only 1 crown, and 1 year that would reshape English history forever. And so in 1066, England stood on the edge of a storm. This wasn't just a dramatic year, it was brutal. In September, Harold marched north to face Harald Hardrada, who had invaded England with a Viking army. The two met at Stamford Bridge, and the ensuing battle was a victorious one for Harold. Hardrada was killed, the Viking age symbolically ended, and Harold's army, exhausted, wounded and bloodied, barely had time to breathe. Harold then had to march his army nearly 250 miles south because Duke William of Normandy landed on England's southern coast at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex, where he fortified his position by occupying an old Roman fort. Under a forced march, it took Harold Godwinson and his army nearly 2 weeks to meet Duke William of Normandy. On October the 14th, near a hill called Senlac in Hastings, the two armies met. Harold's forces formed a shield wall on a ridge, a dense barrier of interlocked shields and spears, one of the Anglo-Saxon warriors' most efficient battle tactics. The Norman army below was a mix of infantry, archers and heavily armoured cavalry, something the English lacked. The fighting was savage and lasted all day. At first the English held firm. Norman attacks broke against the dense shield wall again and again, but then, whether by accident or strategy, some Norman troops retreated. English soldiers chased them downhill, breaking their formation. William's cavalry saw their opportunity, turned and cut them down. The shield wall had finally begun to crumble. Then came the moment that legend would immortalise. Harold was struck down. You may well have seen the image. Harold struck in the eye by an arrow. It's iconic, it's dramatic, but it may not be true. The Bayeux Tapestry, the closest thing we have to a contemporary visual record, shows a figure clutching his eye beneath the words, "Here King Harold is killed." But historians have argued for centuries over what's actually depicted. Was Harold killed by an arrow? Was he cut down by Norman knights? Was his body mutilated beyond recognition on the battlefield? But what we do know is this. By the end of the day, Harold Godwinson was dead. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, were dead, and the Anglo-Saxon army was shattered. William, Duke of Normandy, had won the battle, but he had won the greater prize too. He had won the kingdom of Angleland, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of England. On Christmas Day 1066, Duke William of Normandy, the would-be invader was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest reshaped England's language, culture, architecture, and ruling class. Castles rose across the land, French words flooded into English, and power shifted permanently. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a clash of swords, it was the birth of a new England. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after Harold's death is where the mystery truly begins. In medieval warfare, kings were valuable, even in death. A king's body was proof of victory, a political symbol, a tool of legitimacy. William the Conqueror, as he was soon to be known, needed to show that Harold was dead, that the English line, the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, was broken, that resistance was futile. So, where was Harold's body? Well, according to Norman sources, the battlefield was so strewn with corpses that identifying the king was nearly impossible. One account claims Harold's mother, Gaitha, offered William the weight of her son's body in gold for its return. William supposedly refused. Another version says he agreed, but buried Harold in an unmarked grave near the sea, declaring it a fitting place for a man who guarded the coast. Already the stories contradict each other, and that is just the beginning. And so let's meet a new character in this mysterious tale, a lady called Edith Swanneck, also known as Ealdgyth, who was a long-time partner of Harold Godwinson. Edith was a powerful and wealthy Anglo-Danish noblewoman and the long-term common law wife of Harold Godwinson. She was married to Harold in the Danish manner. She was hand-fasted, a recognised form of marriage at the time, for roughly 20 years before Harold officially married, politically, Ealdgyth of Mercia in 1066. Edith Swanneck was a prominent wealthy landowner in East Anglia and held significant high-status, independent wealth that was even recorded in the Domesday Book. Her nickname Swanneck likely comes from later romantic legend, but her role in history is anything but mythical. For as Anglo-Saxon chroniclers tell us, it was Edith Swanneck who was allowed onto the battlefield to try and identify Harold's body. As I have already suggested, one story goes that William refused to return the body of Harold to his mother for proper burial. Chroniclers suggest that Edith Swanneck recognised the mutilated body of Harold simply by markings on his body, scars that only she would know. This information, if true, is extraordinary because it suggests that Edith Swanneck played the crucial role in ensuring that Harold received an honourable burial fit for a king. This portrays an intimate moment, a tragic moment, but it also raises a crucial question. If Harold's body was identified, what happened to it next? Well, if we accept that Harold Godwinson was killed at the Battle of Hastings and his body was identified by Edith Swanneck, the following account will make some sense. A decade before the Battle of Hastings, Harold Godwinson founded the Collegiate Church at Waltham, which became Waltham Abbey, close to the River Lee, just north of Greater London. One of the most commonly accepted theories as to where Harold Godwinson was buried after the Battle of Hastings is that he was indeed buried at Waltham Abbey. But how can we know this, and how can we be sure that this is true? When in 1177, a document called De Inventione Sancta Crucis Nostra, which of course is Latin, and in fact means concerning the discovery of the Holy Cross, was written by one of Waltham Abbey's canons, who had in fact in turn learnt the details from the church's previous canons at Waltham Abbey. Now, of course, alarm bells should be ringing somewhat at this point, because of course this document, this medieval manuscript, is not a first-hand document. This is information that has been handed down from canon to canon over time. And of course, we all know that information can change, be embellished, or bits could be missing out. So we must be careful when we consider the quality of the evidence that we have here. Nevertheless, the document, the manuscript, is still very intriguing, and it suggests that Harold's body was actually initially buried at the battle site and was later identified by Edith Swanneck, whereupon Harold Godwinson's remains were taken to his church at Waltham Abbey and reburied with great ceremony. So the canon has written, or wrote in the medieval manuscript, that the body of Harold Godwinson was actually moved 3 times between the years 1124 and 1177. And during those movements of his body, the exact place of the final burial became lost and is still currently unknown. But there is a simple stone slab at Waltham Abbey today, which you can see, which marks a potential spot where Harold Godwinson may perhaps be buried. Now, a cynic would of course say, well, there's actually no evidence that Harold is buried here. We have a manuscript written sometime after Harold has supposedly died, and there is no eyewitness accounts of his body actually being moved to Waltham Abbey. It's perhaps what we might call hearsay that has been handed down. So why would Waltham Abbey, the canon of Waltham Abbey, or the canons through successive time periods, make a story up like this? Well, the obvious reason is to encourage pilgrims to come. If you encourage pilgrims to come to an important abbey to view the last Anglo-Saxon king, or the body of the last Anglo-Saxon king, pilgrims are going to bring money and gifts with them, and they will typically donate these to the church. So, at a basic level, it's a way of the church making money, and we can't ignore that possibility. So we sort of come to an unsatisfactory resolution whereby we cannot say with confidence that Harold Godwinson lies at Waltham Abbey. He may be there, but it could all just be a lot of publicity and hearsay from a later time period. And of course, there is no body, is there? And that would be that. The story might be consigned to history if it wasn't for an interesting turn of events that occurred in 2015. In 2015, the team behind the discovery of the remains of Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, whose remains were discovered underneath a car park in Leicester in 2012. This was an incredible story, an historical story and discovery at the time, and remains a fascinating bit of archaeological research and detective work. And so this same team wanted to test a controversial theory proposed by the historian and author Peter Burke. Now, Burke suggested that Harold Godwinson did not die at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, but in fact lived on for up to another 40 years, living as a hermit near Waltham Abbey. A hermit, if you're not aware, is somebody that would have lived in isolation, would have lived a very basic and pious life away from society. So Peter Burke had carried out a lot of research, and he proposed a location close to an ancient wall in the grounds of Waltham Abbey Church. Now, I should have mentioned actually that during the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the late 1530s and early 1540s, Waltham Abbey was not spared either, and Waltham Abbey was largely destroyed. So the structure that Harold Godwinson would have known, the Waltham Abbey of his time, does not exist today. But anyhow, Peter Burke suggested a location that he thought was viable for investigation. So the archaeological team used ground-penetrating radar to scan the ground at this particular location. And their results suggested that they had found a grave-like structure close to the location Peter Burke had suggested, and they felt like, or they suggested that this structure needed further investigation. And an application was made to English Heritage, who look after this site, for a license to examine the grave, exhume any potential bones, and conduct DNA testing to establish whether, well, if they found any bones, of course, that they were those of Harold Godwinson. It's a very similar process that was carried out with the remains of Richard III. DNA analysis was carried out to match him to living relatives, so they were able to work out that that was Richard III when they found the skeleton beneath the car park. So the archaeological team wanted to conduct similar tests and a similar excavation, and Burke was confident that the site marked the final resting place of Harold Godwinson. However, the bid to English Heritage to exhume or to excavate at this potential gravesite was rejected. And the reasons given was that their English Heritage felt that there was a low probability of finding identifiable remains, and the inability or difficulty to link them to any living descendants. So unfortunately, what this actually meant is that the project, if you like, never got off the ground. The team have never been able to take a look at what they believe is a grave-like structure. So unfortunately, none of us are any the wiser as to whether this potential gravesite is the final resting place of Harold Godwinson. So in fact, the mystery continues. We're not actually getting any further with our investigation as to where Harold Godwinson could be. It's frustrating that we have a site that has potential, but of course, you have to go through the legal routes, and if you hit a brick wall at that point, what can you do? You can only perhaps regroup and try again at another point, and perhaps that may occur in the future. In my opinion, I hope they do get the opportunity to excavate this site. It can only further our knowledge in what is a very complex case. Finding the body of a king that died in 1066 potentially, or maybe not in 1066, as the case may be here, is tricky, is very, very tricky, but we surely would learn something by excavating this site. We might just establish that it isn't Harold Godwinson perhaps, but that's useful in my opinion. Waltham Abbey has a long tradition of being the location where the last king of the Anglo-Saxons, Harold Godwinson, is laid to rest. And it makes sense because the 12th century chroniclers talk about the fact that he was buried there, and the canons, as we've discussed, mentioned that his body was brought to his own church, to Harold's church. But there is another possibility of where Harold Godwinson's final resting place could be, and this is on the historic coast of West Sussex in England, in the village of Bosham. And it's here that the mystery continues. Now, there's a reason why Bosham is an important fishing village on the West Sussex coast. It's not just a random location that has been chosen for a potential burial site for Harold Godwinson. It was Harold's, or Bosham was Harold's home territory, his home region, and is famously depicted twice in the Bayeux Tapestry. And that's the embroidered 11th century masterpiece that tells the story of the Norman conquest and the Battle of Hastings. Now, in those scenes in the Bayeux Tapestry, Harold is depicted as visiting a church in 1064 and feasting in a grand Anglo-Saxon hall before sailing to France. And he then visited this grand hall and church upon his return. Now, until recently, the precise location of this Anglo-Saxon hall, the residence, has remained a mystery. Now, that all began to change thanks to a team of archaeologists from Newcastle University and the University of Exeter. Their work was published in the Antiquaries Journal in January 2025, and it revealed evidence that may finally pinpoint Harold's long-lost elite residence, or Anglo-Saxon Grand Hall, in Bosham. And it comes with a rather unexpected clue. Now, let's title this section of the podcast A Toilet, a Tapestry and a Truth. Yes, you heard right, a toilet. So let's rewind back to 2006, when an excavation in Bosham by West Sussex Archaeology uncovered the remains of a latrine, a toilet, with a large Anglo-Saxon timber structure. At the time of its discovery, it was noted and recorded, but not fully understood. Over the past decade, though, researchers have realised that the internal latrines are rare and typically associated with high-status dwellings of the 10th and 11th century. So let's fast forward to 2025, so just last year, where researchers led by Dr. Duncan Wright at Newcastle University and Professor Oliver Crichton at Exeter University re-examined this data, along with geophysical surveys, historical maps and records of actual standing remains. And they concluded that this latrine or toilet was no ordinary outhouse, no ordinary toilet, but a marker of elite status. So this means that somebody with immense wealth built this toilet, or used this toilet even. The timber building that once housed it was likely part of a royal residence. That hall shown in the Bayeux Tapestry, perhaps. Dr. Wright, reflecting on the evidence, described the latrine as almost like an Anglo-Saxon ensuite, crucial in flagging the site as a high-status centre long before the Norman conquest. Professor Crichton went even further, calling it an Anglo-Saxon show home, a rare and valuable glimpse into the domestic world of early medieval English royalty. What's more, the team identified not just one but two medieval buildings on the site, one integrated into a modern private house and the other in the garden, along with the surviving church referenced in the tapestry narratives, the Bayeux Tapestry. So, what does this mean in terms of Harold's burial, or where Harold could be buried? Well, if this site in Bosham is indeed Harold's own long-lost residence, his elite centre, a power centre, where he entertained, strategized and lived, then it raises exciting possibilities about where he may have been buried after his death in 1066. Historians and enthusiasts have long speculated that the king might have been buried or interred near his estate, this estate, perhaps even in Bosham's Holy Trinity Church itself. Now we come to the point where the plot thickens further. In 1954, workmen replacing stones under the chancel of Holy Trinity Church discovered a coffin containing an Anglo-Saxon skeleton, missing its head and part of its leg, but it was buried in a well-crafted stone coffin near where royalty may have been buried, in the prominent location in a church. Could these remains be those of Harold Godwinson, or Harold II, as he should perhaps be formally known, the last king of the Anglo-Saxons? King Harold, the last king of the Anglo-Saxons. His whereabouts remain a mystery, but could Bosham be the location of his final resting place? Amateur historian John Pollock, who lives in the village of Bosham, certainly thinks that this is where the king lies. Mr. Pollock is quoted as saying, "I am absolutely convinced that it is Harold in there. The church already claims to be the final resting place of King Canute's daughter, and the village is awash with seafaring tales and medieval myths, ranging from a spooky bell heard at sea to hidden tunnels under the streets." Mr. Pollock has extensively researched this subject, and in his own words says of the 1954 discovery of bones at the Holy Trinity Church in Bosham, the investigations were a mess and totally unscientific. One reason for doing this again is to look at the physical evidence surrounding the tomb and make absolutely sure it is from the 11th century. They didn't have DNA in the 50s, and carbon dating has only just come in. There's a much more scientific approach now. So when Mr. Pollock is talking about doing this again, he is talking about re-examining the bones that were found in 1954 under part of the Holy Trinity Church at Bosham. Now, of course, in the modern day, if you want to examine bones, you have to have permission. You have to have legal permission to examine any human bones. And that is, of course, after they've been deemed not of current value to the police. And by that, I just mean that it's important that the police are able to examine any bones that are found and ascertain, make sure that they are not of anything that is part of a criminal act. In other words, a murder or something similar. And the added difficulty that Mr. Pollock faced is that these bones were found in a church setting, in consecrated ground. So Mr. Pollock would have needed extra permission from the church council in order to have these bones scientifically examined. And so in 2003, a parochial church council on behalf of Mr. Pollock applied for human remains buried below the chancel arch at Holy Trinity Church, Bosham, to be unearthed and scientifically examined to see if science could finally put an end to the mystery of where Harold Godwinson is buried. A special session of the Chichester Diocese Consistory Court opened at Holy Trinity Church in 2003, and witnesses gave evidence to suggest that this is where King Harold could possibly be buried. And a television production company were funded and were eager to tell the story of the final resting place of King Harold II. The bones were planned to be subjected to DNA analysis, and a match would be sought with a direct descendant of the king, if they could be found, to prove that these bones underneath Holy Trinity Church belonged to Harold Godwinson, the last king of the Anglo-Saxons. Archaeologist Timothy Tatton Brown told the hearing, and I quote, "There is strong evidence that they are remains of an important person. A thorough investigation would be of interest in the context of the history of this church. Bosham appears in the Bayeux Tapestry, and the site is mentioned in Bede as the earliest known Christian settlement in Sussex. This could illuminate that history." Mr. Tatton Brown went on to say it would be essential to clean up the area and repair any damage that was also caused by the 1954 excavations. But of course, any legal hearing comes with cross-examination, and Mr. Tatton Brown was cross-examined by Justin Gow, and he represented the Archdeacon of Chichester. And under cross-examination, Mr. Tatton Brown did go on to say that he felt it very unlikely that the bones belonged to Harold. Historical architect Richard Maynell mentioned, though, that the floor in the Grade 1 listed church in Bosham needed repairs anyway, and an investigation could be made with little disruption. He said, and I quote, "We have here a church of national importance dating probably back to the Saxon period. We are in a unique situation where there is a good possibility that an important person is buried underneath where I am standing. There is the opportunity for that to be further investigated with experienced professionals." The vicar of the church at Bosham also had something to say, and Canon Thomas Inman said, "For some people, there is an abhorrence in disturbing a body, no matter how long after a Christian burial. The council believes this is an aspect of our history which would be beneficial to the history of the parish." So here we have a member of the clergy, and some would say a forward-thinking member of the clergy, who is willing to accept that the bones will offer some historical, or a lot of historical value to the community if they could be analysed. Opposition, though, was also voiced by the Council for the Care of Churches, who remained opposed to the idea that bodies given a Christian burial could be dug up, other than in exceptional circumstances. Dr. Joseph Elders went on to say there would be far-reaching consequences if the disinterment was allowed. He went on to say, and I quote, "The parish has not made a convincing case. This proposal would set a precedent for sensational exhumation on the weakest or no evidence." Mr. Elders also disapproved of taking DNA evidence, as he believed it would lead to further destruction of some of the bones. So after both parties had said their piece and given their argument for and against having these bones disturbed, it was down to Mark Hill, the Chancellor of the Diocese of Chichester, to finally decide if the bones had laid underneath Bosham's Holy Trinity Church for centuries could finally be subjected to scientific investigation that would hopefully ascertain as to whether or not King Harold II, Harold Godwinson, King of the Anglo-Saxons, was buried underneath a little church on the west coast of Sussex.
And so, after the consistory court was held at Bosham Church on the 24th of November 2023, the Chancellor of the Diocese of Chichester, the Worshipful Mark Hill, made his decision. He described the case as a complex scientific, historic and archaeological set of issues, but ultimately the Chancellor dismissed the petition. These bones buried underneath Bosham's church would remain hidden. When giving an explanation for his judgment, Hill said the following: "There is a presumption against exhumation which can only be overturned by an overwhelming case for the necessity of research. There may well be, in this case, a legitimate national historic interest in identifying the final resting place of the only English monarch, since Edward the Confessor, of whom this is unknown. Those wishing to examine the remains have the laudable objective of wanting to prove that they are those of Harold, but I am far from satisfied that their proposal will advance their aim. It is a matter of conjecture whether any human remains will be found in the coffin. Such remains as may be found are highly unlikely to be those of Harold, since the vast preponderance of academic opinion points to him having been buried at Waltham Abbey. Any DNA testing is futile because of the improbability of finding proven present-day descendants whose own DNA could be compared. And the margin of error in carbon dating testing can, be best, only produce an inconclusive result. The prospect of obtaining a meaningful result is so remote in this instance that the presumption against disturbance is not displaced. The evidence led by the petitioners fails to come near to the standard required. The petition therefore fails." And so we come to an unsatisfactory ending with the Bosham story. Is he buried? Is Harold buried beneath Bosham Church? He may well be, but until the skeleton can be examined, we cannot know for sure. But the greater question that can be asked is why, after nearly 1,000 years, do people still care about where Harold Godwinson, the defeated king after all, why do people care about where he is buried? Well, it's because Harold's burial isn't just about bones. It's about identity, it's about conquest, and it's about who gets to write history. The Normans won the battle, but they also won the narrative. And when history is written by the victors, silence can be as powerful as lies. A missing grave is a missing voice.
I feel the soil breathe beneath my feet. Roots like whispers tangle.
History usually loves to talk. Kings are catalogued, battles are mapped, bodies are buried, named and remembered. But when it comes to Harold Godwinson's final resting place, history falls strangely silent. No royal tomb, no state funeral, no agreed-upon grave. And that silence isn't accidental, because after 1066, England didn't just get a new king. It got a new ruling class, a new language of power, and a new version of the past. William didn't just conquer England with swords, he conquered it with paperwork. The Domesday Book, land redistribution, ecclesiastical reform, castle building on an industrial scale, and rewriting memory. The Anglo-Saxon elite were dispossessed, English bishops replaced, monasteries reorganised under Norman control, and Harold, he became an inconvenience. Norman chroniclers portray him as an oath-breaker, a usurper, a man punished by God. The Bayeux Tapestry itself, commissioned by William's half-brother, tells a carefully curated story. Harold is shown swearing an oath to William. His death is framed as inevitable, almost righteous. A man like that didn't deserve a heroic tomb. He deserved to disappear. In fact, the exact location of the Battle of Hastings itself was debated for centuries. The traditional site near Battle Abbey was chosen deliberately by William, who founded the abbey as penance for the bloodshed. That means the landscape was altered. Graves may have been moved. Evidence may have been destroyed. Mass graves? Quite possibly. Individual graves and burials would be rare. A royal burial? Well, this would be unlikely to survive intact. And even if bones were found, how would we identify Harold when we have no confirmed DNA, no preserved royal lineage, no personal artefacts tied definitively to his body? Harold, it seems, is archaeologically invisible. To understand why this matters, we need to talk about medieval power. A king's corpse wasn't just a body, it was a statement. Buried with honour, the king is legitimate, even in defeat. Denied burial, the king is erased. William understood this. By refusing or controlling Harold's burial, William controlled the story of succession. No shrine meant no rallying point, no tomb meant no symbol for rebellion. And rebellions did come. The harrying of the north, as it came to be known, required William the Conqueror and his military to crush intense Anglo-Saxon and Danish resistance in northern England. By burning crops, livestock and villages, William aimed to starve the region. But this resulted in a famine that killed an estimated 100,000 or more people and devastated the economy. But just imagine if those rebels had a grave to gather around, a fallen king to pray to. William wasn't about to allow that. And yet people talked. Quietly later, in monasteries and margins, by the 12th century, multiple sources repeat the claim. Harold survived. One chronicler describes a disfigured man living as a hermit near Dover. Another claims he lived for decades unrecognised. And another says he revealed himself on his deathbed, asking forgiveness. Are these stories true? Almost certainly not. But here's why they matter. Survival legends appear when a people are conquered. They express hope, they deny finality, and they say, you may have taken our land, but you didn't take our king. William the Conqueror has a tomb. It's in Caen in France. It's marked and it's visited. Harold does not. And that's the difference. It tells us everything. Conquest doesn't just reshape borders, it reshapes remembrance. Harold lost not only his crown, but his place in the ground. And yet, nearly 1,000 years later, we still speak his name. So why does the mystery endure? Well, it's because it's unfinished, because it sits at the fault line between English and Norman, fact and propaganda, history and myth. Harold's missing grave forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is not just what happened, it's what survived, and sometimes what survived is a question. Somewhere in England, beneath stone or soil or story, King Harold may still lie, or perhaps he never did. Perhaps his fate was to vanish, to become a symbol rather than a skeleton, a king without a tomb, a defeat without closure, a question that refuses to be buried. And maybe that's fitting, because the last Anglo-Saxon king didn't just lose a battle, he lost his place in history's certainty. And until we find him or finally stop looking, the mystery of Harold Godwinson remains open. This really is a true mystery of history. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Mysteries of History podcast. If you've enjoyed listening to this mystery, this podcast is available on all of the major platforms
Just search for The Mysteries of History and you'll find us. Why not follow us at the M of H on Instagram or TikTok, or The Mysteries of History on Facebook. It's here that we'll post even more mysterious and historical content.
So until next time, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.